By 1942, the German Luftwaffe pilots in North Africa felt they were fighting an enemy fighting with one hand tied behind its back. They flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109F and G. Friedrich and Gustav. These were high-altitude interceptors, light, fast, and deadly climbing machines. The British and Americans were flying the Curtiss P-40, known to the British as the Tomahawk and later the Kitty Hawk. German intelligence had analyzed the P-40. Their conclusion was damning. It is too heavy, the report said. It has no supercharger. Its performance above 15,000 feet is pitiful. The German aces, men like Hans-Joachim Marseille, the star of Africa, treated the P-40 with disdain. They called it a cement bomber. They believed it was a fighter plane that flew like a brick. When a flight of Bf 109 spotted P-40s, they would simply climb. They would go up to 20,000 feet, where the P-40's Allison engine gasped for air. From this high perch, the Germans would dive, fire, and zoom back up. The P-40 pilots could only watch, helpless, as the Germans dictated the battle. The Luftwaffe morale was high. They believed the Allies were technologically inferior. They thought the Americans had sent a dump truck to a Formula One race. But they were making a critical mistake. They were judging the plane by its stats on paper, not by its behavior in a brawl. They assumed the P-40 would always be an easy kill. They didn't realize that the cement bomber had a jaw of iron and fists of steel, and if they ever came down from their high-altitude perch, they would be stepping into a boxing ring with a heavyweight. The air war is defined by altitude. At 25,000 feet, the air is thin. Engines need mechanical help to breathe. The Bf 109 had a sophisticated supercharger that pumped air into the engine, maintaining power in the stratosphere. The P-40 had a simple, single-stage supercharger. As a P-40 climbed past 12,000 feet, its power curve flattened. By 18,000 feet, it was sluggish. German pilots knew this. They lived in that high castle of the sky. But the war in North Africa wasn't being fought at 25,000 feet. It was being fought on the ground. The tanks, Rommel's Afrika Korps and Montgomery's 8th Army, were churning up the dust of the desert floor. To support them, the planes had to come down. The oxygen line, around 10,000 feet, became the dividing line between life and death. Above the line, the Bf 109 was king. Below the line, the physics changed. In the thick, dense air near the ground, the P-40's Allison VR 1710 engine was a beast. It produced massive torque. Its aerodynamic drag was lower than the messy Bf 109, which had slats and radiators sticking out. The Allied commanders, men like Air Vice Marshal Arthur Coningham, changed the tactics. Don't chase them up, they told the P-40 pilots. Drag them down. They began to fly low patrols. They forced the Germans to come down to the deck to fight. And when a German ace dove his sleek Messerschmitt below 5,000 feet to finish off a helpless P-40, he found a nasty surprise. The P-40 wasn't sluggish anymore. It was fast. It rolled quickly. And it could turn with a violence that the delicate German planes couldn't match. The Germans were leaving their element and entering the P-40's kill zone. The men who flew the P-40 in the desert were a special breed. The Desert Air Force, DAF, was a mix of Royal Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, RAF, South Africans, and Americans. They lived in tents in the sand. They battled sandstorms, flies, and dysentery. They loved the P-40. The British Spitfire was a better interceptor, but it was delicate. The sand chewed up its engines. Its narrow landing gear made it tricky to land on rough desert strips. The P-40 was a tractor. It had rugged, wide-track landing gear. It had heavy armor plate. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that actually worked. The pilots called it the Kitty Hawk. They knew they couldn't outclimb the Germans, so they learned to outfight them. They developed the shark fin tactic. They would fly in a line abreast. When a German attacked, they would turn into the attack, presenting a wall of guns. They knew that their 6.50 caliber machine guns were far superior to the German mix of cannons and light machine guns. A German plane hit by a .50 cal burst fell apart. A P-40 hit by German fire often just kept flying. The ruggedness of the P-40 became a strategic asset. While German mechanics were struggling to keep their high-strung engines running in the dust, the P-40s were flying for sorties a day. The desert rats of the air forced the Germans into a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, the durable plane beats the high-performance plane. The German pilots, who looked down on the ugly P-40, began to realize that beauty doesn't stop bullets. The moment the German smirk truly faded was usually in a dive. It is a basic law of aerial combat: if you are in trouble, dive. The Bf-109 was light. It accelerated well, but at very high speeds, its controls stiffened. The fabric-covered control surfaces would balloon out. The pilot would have to fight the stick with both hands just to pull out. The P-40 was heavy. It was built like a bridge. When a P-40 pilot pushed the nose over, the heavy Allison engine acted like a lead weight. The plane accelerated screamingly fast. But crucially, the P-40 had metal-skinned control surfaces and a hydraulic boost system. Even at 450 or 500 miles per hour, the P-40 remained controllable. This led to a terrifying realization for German pilots. A Bf-109 pilot would bounce a P-40. The P-40 would dive. The German would follow, thinking he had the kill. But as the speed built up, the German pilot would lose control authority. His plane would start to buffet. He would have to pull out or risk tearing his wings off. The P-40 would keep diving, stable and fast. Then, the P-40 pilot would use that kinetic energy. He would pull back on the stick. The heavy American plane would soon climb back up, converting speed into altitude. Suddenly, the German pilot, who had just pulled out of his dive and bled off his speed, would look up. And he would see the P-40 coming back down on him. The boom and zoom, usually an American tactic used against the Japanese, worked against the Germans too, if the fight started fast enough. The Germans realized that the flying brick fell faster than they did. And if they tried to follow it into the abyss, the P-40 would be the only one coming back up. When the German Bf-109s used their superior altitude to bounce a squadron of P-40s, the Allied pilots often resorted to a tactic that dated back to World War I. The Germans called it the Abwehrkreis, the defensive circle. The Allies called it a Luftwaffe. The P-40s would turn hard and form a continuous, tight circle, flying nose to tail. To the arrogant Luftwaffe pilots circling above, it looked pathetic. It looked passive. "They are hiding like frightened sheep," the German aces would radio to each other. They saw it as an admission of inferiority, a refusal to come out and fight like men. But the Luftwaffe was not a posture of submission, it was a porcupine. In the circle, every P-40 was protecting the tail of the plane in front of it. If a German pilot dove down to attack a P-40 in the circle, he had to fly in a straight line to line up his shot. The moment he straightened out, the P-40 behind his target would pull its nose up and unleash a torrent of .50 caliber fire into the German's belly. The Germans grew frustrated. They would circle endlessly overhead, burning precious fuel, trying to goad the P-40s to break formation. Sometimes, a young, impatient German pilot would try to slash through the circle. He rarely made it out. The P-40 was uniquely suited for this tactic. Its low-speed handling was excellent, allowing it to hold a tight turn without stalling. Its rugged construction meant it could absorb the punishing G-forces of a continuous turn for 10 or 15 minutes. The defensive circle turned a tactical disadvantage into a stalemate. It neutralized the German boom and zoom advantage. The Germans learned that the sheep down below had very sharp teeth, and the only way to attack them was to step into a bear trap. By April 1943, the German Afrika Korps was trapped in Tunisia. Their only lifeline was an air bridge of Junkers Ju-52 transport planes flying in fuel and supplies from Italy. The Allies knew this. They set a trap. On April 18, Palm Sunday, a massive flight of German transports, escorted by Bf-109s and twin-engine Bf-110s, flew low over the Mediterranean, hugging the waves to avoid radar. They were spotted. The Allied response was overwhelming. For squadrons of P-40 Kitty Hawks, flown by Americans, South Africans, and Australians, and one squadron of Spitfires swooped down. It was the perfect setup. The high-flying Spitfires took on the German fighter escorts, keeping them busy upstairs. The P-40s went down to the deck. To the slaughter. The Ju-52 was a slow, three-engine, corrugated metal transport. Against a modern fighter, it was helpless. The P-40s tore into them like wolves into a flock of slow-moving sheep. It wasn't a dogfight, it was execution. The Allied pilots didn't even need to aim carefully. They just lined up behind the lumbering transports and held down the triggers. The P-40's heavy machine guns sawed the wings off the Ju-52s. Engines burst into flames. One after another, the German transport smashed into the sea. The water was covered with burning gasoline and wreckage. In 20 minutes, the P-40s shot down between 50 and 70 German aircraft. The Allied losses were negligible. The Palm Sunday massacre broke the back of the German supply line. The German pilots who survived were horrified. They had watched their comrades be annihilated by planes they considered inferior. That cement bomber had proven that when it caught the enemy on its own terms, low and heavy, it was absolute master of the sky. The debate over fighter armament in World War II was intense. The Germans preferred cannon, 20mm or 30mm explosive shells. They did massive damage with a single hit, but they fired slowly and carried little ammunition. The Americans chose the Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun. The P-40 carried 6 of them in the wings. It was a weapon of brute force. Unmatched didn't fire explosive shells, it fired solid, armor-piercing incendiary slugs. But it fired them fast, 800 rounds per minute per gun. When a P-40 pilot pressed the trigger, he was unleashing nearly 5,000 rounds per minute. The result was a cone of fire that acted like a flying chainsaw. German aircraft, particularly the Bf-109, were surprisingly fragile. They relied on speed, not structural strength. When a burst of 6.50 cals hit a Messerschmitt, it didn't just poke holes. The sheer kinetic energy of hundreds of heavy slugs hitting simultaneously would disintegrate structure. Wings would shear off. Tails would detach. Engine blocks would crack. German pilots who survived being hit by P-40s reported a terrifying sound, like being inside a steel drum being hit by sledgehammers. The P-40 carried enough ammunition for about 15 to 20 seconds of sustained fire, an eternity in an aerial dogfight. The German pilots, with their limited cannon shells, had to be snipers. The P-40 pilots could afford to spray the sky. German mechanics were appalled by the damage on planes that limped home. They found spars cut in half and armor plating punched through like cheese. The Germans mocked the P-40 for not having cannons. The American reply was simple: we don't need them. There is no more terrifying moment in aerial combat than the merge. Two fighters, flying directly at each other at a combined speed of over 700 miles per hour. It is a game of chicken played with machine guns. In a head-on pass, the advantage shifted dramatically to the P-40. The German Bf-109 had a liquid-cooled engine, like the P-40. But its cooling system was vulnerable. A single hit to the radiators located in the wings or nose would cause the engine to seize up in minutes. The pilot sat behind the engine, relatively exposed from the front. The P-40 pilot sat behind a massive Allison VR-12 engine block. He was protected by a bulletproof windscreen and heavy armor plating in the cowl. The P-40 was a flying tank. When a German pilot saw a P-40 coming straight at him, often painted with a terrifying shark mouth design on the massive radiator intake, he had to make a choice. If he held his course and fired, he might hit the P-40. But the P-40 would definitely hit him. And the P-40 could absorb a few 20mm hits and keep flying. The Bf-109 could not survive a faceful of .50 caliber slugs. The psychological weight of the American plane's ruggedness broke the German nerve. Time and again, at the last second, the German pilot would flinch. He would pull back on the stick to climb over the P-40. This was fatal. As the German pulled up, he exposed the entire belly of his aircraft, the fuel tanks, the cockpit floor, the radiator, to the P-40's guns. The American pilot wouldn't flinch. He would just raise his nose slightly and rake the underside of the Messerschmitt as it went by. The Germans called the P-40 primitive because it was heavy. In a head-on fight, that weight was a weapon. It was the difference between a rapier and a broadsword. By 1943, the air war moved from the deserts of Africa to the skies over Italy. The Germans were now flying improved versions of the Bf-109 and the fearsome Focke-Wulf 190. They still considered the P-40 obsolete meat on the table. The 325th Fighter Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces set out to prove them wrong. They painted the tails of their P-40s with distinctive black and yellow checkers. They became known as the Checkertail Clan. And they became the scourge of the Luftwaffe over the Mediterranean. The Checkertail pilots knew the limitations of their mount. They didn't try to fight a high-altitude energy war. They dragged the Germans down into the weeds. Over the island of Sardinia, the Checkertails engaged a superior force of German fighters. In a swirling, low-level dogfight, a furball, the P-40s were in their element. They could turn inside the faster German planes. They used teamwork, one pilot baiting a German while his wingman tore him apart with .50 caliber fire. In a series of intense air battles in mid-1943, the Checkertails racked up lopsided kill ratios against the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. German intelligence officers were baffled. They were interrogating down German aces who reported being shot down by those damn checkered P-40s. It defied their data. The P-40 was slower. It climbed worse. But in the hands of aggressive, well-trained pilots who refused to fight the enemy's fight, the obsolete Warhawk remained a lethal weapon. The checkered tail became a symbol that the Luftwaffe learned to avoid. If there was one trait of the P-40 that drove German pilots to distraction more than any other, it was its refusal to die. Curtiss had built the plane like a bridge. It had a 5-spar wing structure, making it incredibly stiff and strong. The cockpit was heavily armored. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. German fighter design emphasized lightness and performance over durability. A few well-placed hits on a Bf-109 would usually bring it down. Not so the P-40. German gun camera footage from the era often shows P-40s absorbing horrifying amounts of punishment. Pieces flying off the wings, smoke pouring from the engine, holes blown in the fuselage big enough to put a fist through. Yet, the plane would fly on. Allied airfields in North Africa and Italy were used to the sight of P-40s returning looking like flying sieves. Rudders shot away. Elevators hanging by a wire. Half a wing missing. But the landing gear would lock down, and the pilot would taxi in. For the German pilot who had expended all his ammunition trying to kill this beast, it was demoralizing. For the Allied pilot, it was the ultimate confidence booster. They knew that even if they made a mistake, even if the German got the drop on them, their plane would likely bring them home. The Germans mocked it as a cement bomber, but in a long, grueling campaign, a plane that survives to fight another day is worth its weight in gold. By late 1943 and early 1944, superior Allied fighters like the Spitfire Mk9, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-51 Mustang began to arrive in theater in large numbers. These planes could beat the Germans at high altitude. The P-40's days as an air superiority fighter were over. But the P-40 didn't retire. It just changed jobs. It became the premier ground attack aircraft of the Mediterranean theater. The very things that made it a mediocre interceptor, its weight and heavy structure, made it a brilliant dive bomber. It was a stable gun platform. It could carry a 500-pound bomb under the belly, and sometimes smaller bombs under the wings. The kitty bombers, as the British called them, became the terror of the German army on the ground in Italy. They would dive almost vertically, release their bombs with pinpoint accuracy on bridges, tanks, and artillery positions, and then use the zoom climb to escape the flak. Its ruggedness meant it could shrug off the light ground fire that would bring down a liquid-cooled Mustang. The German soldiers on the ground, who used to cheer when they saw the inferior P-40s being chased by Bf-109s high above, learned a new respect for the shark mouth shape when it was coming down right on top of their heads at 400 miles per hour. It was the ultimate workhorse, dangerous to the very end. The Curtiss Pa-40 Warhawk was never the best fighter of the war. It wasn't the fastest. It didn't climb the highest. German pilots, flying their technological marvels, had every right on paper to mock it. But wars aren't fought on paper. The Pa-40 was available when nothing else was. It held the line in North Africa when the British were reeling and the Americans were just learning how to fight. It fought in the dust, the heat, and the mud, operating from primitive airfields where more delicate thoroughbreds would have broken down. It took the best shots the Luftwaffe could deliver and kept flying. The German mockery faded as the war went on. It was replaced by a grudging, frustrated respect for a stubborn opponent that just wouldn't go away. The Pa-40 was the shield that protected the Allied armies until the sword, the Mustangs and Thunderbolts, could be forged. It was ugly, it was heavy, and it was tough as nails. And in the critical years of 1942 and 1943 in the Mediterranean, it was exactly what was needed to win.